Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I built this realistic 302 Boss Mustang Model Kit. This was a really challenging build for me, and I'll get into why later in the video, but overall, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. Let's get started. The first thing that I did after unboxing the kit was to get to work on the main body of the car. I wasn't too much of a fan of these molded in windshield wipers, so I decided to remove them. I started by scraping off the top of the wipers with my X-Acto blade, which slowly shaved them flush to the windshield trim. This step is pretty simple but time consuming, and I quickly sanded the surface smooth after scraping. I drilled holes into the body for placing my own windshield wipers that I plan on 3D printing later. The rest of the wiper gets grinded away with a file. My file was a little bit too coarse, but after all the primer I ended up adding, the scratches ended up disappearing. Next, I deepened the panel lines of the doors and trunk using my Tamiya scribing tool. I find that with these older Revell kits that the panel lines are molded in a bit shallow, and scribing them to be deeper makes them look much more realistic. The process is pretty straightforward, just use the blade and run it along the panel lines that you want to deepen. It can be pretty easy to accidentally slip with the tool and make an unwanted scratch on the body, so just make sure to take your time and don't force anything. I use pretty light pressure when scribing, and I go slow for the first few passes. Once the line begins to deepen, then it's easier to go faster. After scribing the lines, I drill out holes for the door locks. Then, I use my old side cutters and remove most of the molded on door handles. The leftover plastic is then scraped away with my X-Acto blade again, and I also plan on replacing these with 3D printed parts. The kit came with a silver decal for the Mustang badge on the trunk that goes over these letters molded into the body. The badge is supposed to be chrome, and I wasn't a fan of the idea to use the silver decal. I also didn't really want to try and hand paint the raised letters with a chrome pen, so I figured I'd scrape away the plastic and 3D print my own badges. I drilled another hole for the trunk lock on the back. The quarter panels on this kit have some pretty prominent mold lines that need to be sanded away. The windshield trim had a couple imperfections from removing the windshield wipers, so I filled them with some Tamiya putty. Some divots on the back of the car were also filled with more putty. Once it dries, I sand everything smooth. I drill more holes for the mirrors, and I also drill a hole into the mirror to install a pin. I'm going to paint the mirrors separately from the body, so adding a pin will allow them to line up properly when I glue them on. Another hole is drilled for the antenna, and then I sand the entire body with some 600 grit sandpaper. I think that the side marker lights would look better as separate pieces, so I mixed up some Tamiya epoxy putty and I filled them in. After sanding the putty smooth, I drill holes in the center for the separate marker lights that I plan on adding later. A couple more holes are drilled for the door handles on either side. The spoiler is assembled with some Tamiya extra thin cement, and then I install a few details into the engine bay along with the suspension. I plan on painting this first. I base coat all of the pieces with my airbrush, and I mask off the rest of the kit while painting the engine bay. This might be a kind of controversial topic because some viewers weren't too happy about it in my Corvette video, but I've watched lots of videos about this kit, and it seems that most people have issues with the hood fitting properly. Since I use my models for dioramas, I'll never need to show the engine, so I glue the hood on because I'd rather have the exterior of the car looking good than have fitment issues that allow me to show the engine underneath. And speaking of fitment issues, the nose piece had a terrible fit. I've seen others that have the same issue as me, but I've also seen some models where the fit looked pretty good, so maybe some kits are good and some aren't. Basically, the nose sat lower than the fenders in the hood, and the body line that extends all the way from the doors was misaligned on this piece. Also, the gap, especially on the passenger side fender, was really noticeable. So even though that the body seam is supposed to be there, I decided it would look cleaner filled. So I used some epoxy putty and I pushed it into the seam to fill it. After the epoxy putty dried, I sanded it back with a sanding sponge. Again, even though it's not entirely accurate, I think it's the easiest and best looking solution to this problem if you have fitment issues like I did. Also, looking at some reference images, the seam isn't too pronounced anyways, definitely not as deep and noticeable as a door line or a hood line. I glued on the rear panel with some plastic cement. The instructions call for this step along with the front nose piece to be installed near the end of the build, but I think gluing both of these pieces on now makes much more sense, and everything ended up going together fine doing it this way anyways. At this point, everything with the body was more or less in place, so I wiped it down with some isopropyl alcohol to get rid of any surface contamination. Then, I took the model outside and quickly gave it a few coats of Tamiya Gray surface primer. Some viewers in my last car video asked why I don't do this step with an airbrush. To put it simply, I find that the can, especially for primer, that I'm going to sand back anyway, does more than a good enough job. After the primer, you can see some imperfections along the seams that need fixing, and some other parts of the body need some fixing as well. They're small enough at this point where they can easily be filled with the normal gray putty. After it dried, I sanded everything back again until it was smooth, and then I gave it another coat of primer. Things were looking really good at this point, just a few minor spots that needed some filling. After this, I primed it white and sanded the entire surface with 2000 grit sandpaper to prep the body for paint. I was really happy with the bodywork at this stage. Unfortunately, later on in the build, I made a mistake which caused the seam that I worked so hard to fill to reappear partially on the driver's side. I'll get to how it happened later on. For these first few coats of paint, I used Tamiya Pure Yellow Lacquer, then with Mr. Leveling Thinner. I don't have any exact ratios, but I'd say it was roughly 40% paint to 60% thinner. I started by spraying the hard to reach areas like around the panel lines and wheel arches before moving on to the rest of the body. When I did spray the body, I would overlap my passes with the airbrush for an even finish. Yellow typically has poor coverage properties as a paint, so it's important to be patient with the paint and build up the color over time. The paint was going on pretty smooth, but it had some dust in certain spots that needed to be sanded out. Also, the color was a bit too greenish in my opinion. The lighting in my paint booth makes colors look more cooler toned, but even outside of it, I thought that the yellow looked too green. After sanding out the dust, I added a few more coats of yellow that I custom mixed to look more like the bright yellow color that the Boss 302 came in 1969. It's hard to see the color change while spraying it in the booth, but hopefully you can see the yellow looks a lot less green once dry. At this point, I masked off the window trim to be painted black. I thought it would be a good idea to do it before clear coating. The clear coat will make the black super shiny, which I think will be a great base coat for the chrome finish that I'll add later on. I sprayed the black paint with low pressure and a pretty thick consistency to prevent the paint from bleeding under the masking tape. Here's how the car looks at this point, and I think that the yellow looks much closer to factory stock than the initial greenish yellow did. Now it's time for the part of the build that made me the most nervous, which was adding decals. I honestly don't have much experience with decals, which is why I wasn't looking forward to this part, but surprisingly I didn't have any issues here. It can be a bit difficult to get the side decals to lay straight, but after some back and forth I think they ended up looking pretty good. For the actual Boss 302, the decals on the side are reflective, but the hood and the trunk are supposed to be flat black. My plan is to actually clear coat over all of the decals and then after polishing go back and mask the hood just inside the small pinstripe. That thicker stripe and all of the yellow behind it will be painted flat black. I got this idea from Muscle Car Modeler here on YouTube, so I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. Now I'm spraying on some 2K clear coat over the body. I waited a couple days after applying the decals to make sure the clear coat didn't have a bad reaction with them. I'm using my airbrush with a 0.5mm needle, and I'm putting on the clear coat pretty wet. Make sure to wear a respirator rated for clear coat. Be sure to do the proper research to keep yourself safe when spraying clear coat or any paint for that matter. Unfortunately, I got a couple pieces of dust in the hood that I needed to sand out. Also, the roof had some blemishes which kinda looked like little craters in the clear coat. I'm not really sure why it happened, maybe some grease or tape residue left on the paint. If you know why this happened, feel free to let me know in the comments. Either way, I wasn't concerned about it because I knew I would sand it out. I start by wet sanding the clear coat with these 6000 grit sanding sponges by God Hand. I typically don't use very much water when wet sanding, just enough water to suspend the dust particles in it. After wiping down the roof, you can see that the surface is much duller. There's still some surface imperfections that need sanding, but this overall will be smoother than the clear coat was before. I continue to sand away the blemishes with the 6000 grit sanding sponge. I know it would be more efficient to use a rougher grit at this stage, but when I built a couple model cars almost 5 years ago, I couldn't polish out the scratches that I made with the 3000 grit Tamiya sanding sponge. I've had really good luck removing the scratches left behind with these sponges that I'm currently using. Here's how the surface looks before sanding, and here's how it looks after sanding. With this step, we're removing any raised blemishes like dust specks and dirt, and also leveling out any orange peel texture from spraying the clear coat. The 6000 grit scratches are further refined with 8000 grit. Going up to finer grits will allow for a much easier time when it comes to polishing. Also, this step goes much quicker than the 6000 grit since the texture has already been leveled. Here's how the model looks after 8000 grit. It's still scratched but slightly shinier than before. Lastly, I go over the surface one more time with 10,000 grit. The process is exactly the same as the 8000 grit, just refining out those rougher scratches. One thing to keep in mind when sanding clear coat is that it's super thin. Be sure not to sand through it, especially on the corners that stick out, as that's pretty easy to do. After the 10,000 grit, you can see that it's even shinier than the 8000 and it's ready to be polished. I use my Display rotary tool along with some cheap foam polishing pads that I got off Amazon to polish the paint. I start with the orange pad with the Manzerna 2500 medium cut polish. All of the polishes that I used were recommended by Paul from Proscale Paints. He has a channel of his own, which I'll link to in the description. I have the rotary tool on the slowest setting, and I make sure to keep the pad moving at all times to prevent burning through the paint. This is the best way to polish model cars in my opinion. It's super quick and efficient, but it's also fun. After the single pass, the paint already has a nice shine again. Up next, I move on to the finer 3500 polish, which will only make the finish look even better. I switched over to the yellow pad on my rotary tool, which is slightly softer than the orange one. Again, I just polished the entire body, being sure to keep the pad moving all times. Lastly, I use the super resin polish by Automotive with the black foam pad, which is the softest one. The polish is much more fine and liquidy than the previous two, and it can be worked for a very long time. I don't know exactly what it is, but polishing is probably one of my favorite parts of building model cars. It's like instant gratification, turning something scratched and dull into a perfect mirror shine. Here's how it looks after polishing, and as you can see, it's super shiny and I'm super happy with the way that it turned out. And here's where unfortunately I made two mistakes on the same day. I masked off the window trim again to paint chrome. I sprayed the black trim with all clad chrome and then sealed it with aqua gloss clear. Honestly, it looked amazing and I was very pleased. But after removing the masking tape, it peeled the clear coat along the bottom edge of the driver's side door. Then, about an hour later, I accidentally dropped the model, and this made a stress fracture along the driver's side seam that I filled along the front nose portion bordering the fender. To be honest, these blemishes aren't too noticeable, but they were really disheartening after spending so much time on the model so far. I thought about sanding out the mistakes and blending the surface with more paint and clear coat, but I figured I might do more harm than good, so I decided I would just live with them. Anyways, I masked off the hood, the trunk, and the rear section by the taillights and sprayed them flat black. I brush painted an acrylic black paint along the inner headlight housing, and I found it to be a lot easier than masking and spraying such a small space. I wasn't too much of a fan of the taillights included in the kit. The real car has chrome trim at the base of each taillight and along the top, and the kit doesn't really allow you to replicate that properly. Also, once installed, the kit parts are very hard to see, almost looking more black than red. So I designed and printed my own taillights, sprayed them chrome, and brush painted their clear red color. The top of each taillight was pretty easy, as I could just flood the surface with a drop of clear red. After the red paint dried, I glued each individual taillight in place using white glue and tweezers. I also installed a small sheet of styrene on the inside of the car for the taillights to have something to glue onto. Next, I glued the glass in place. Unfortunately, I didn't really realize that the shot was out of focus at the moment, but I think you get the idea. I set the glass in place exactly where I wanted it, and then I added some white glue along the edges. Adding a little bit of water will allow the glue to seep under the plastic for a better bond. The chrome light housings were installed on the back side of the grille, and then the clear lenses were glued in front. The two other light housings were installed directly onto the body, again using white glue to hold everything together, and then the grille was glued in place. Here's how the body of the car was looking so far. I absolutely love how reflective the paint is, and taking it outside really shows how shiny it is. Moving on to the rest of the build, now I'm going to work on my 3D printed parts. I designed all of these models in Fusion 360 and printed them on my resin 3D printer. If you'd like to download and 3D print these parts for yourself, these 3D files are available for my Patreon members. Here's how they look after printing. I separated the wheels into multiple pieces for painting, even using individual lug nuts. After removing the supports, I drill out the holes for the lug nuts on the wheels to be just a hair larger. Tolerances in resin printing can be slightly too tight sometimes, so this is an easy fix. Here are a bunch of parts ready to paint. Everything that I plan on spraying chrome gets painted a gloss black finish, which is a great base coat for chrome. Once it dries, I apply several light coats of all-clad chrome over top of the gloss black. The face of each wheel is painted with all-clad steel, which looks awesome and is one of my favorite colors to spray. It dries to a nice satin sheen, and it looks just like the torque wheels seen on the Bullet Mustang. Here are the parts after painting, and I'm super happy with the way they turned out. I start by assembling the wheels by supergluing the lug nuts individually. Very time consuming, but worth it, I think. The wheels that came in the kit are the stock Magnum 500 wheels, which honestly look very nice. The Boss 302 came with the option of steel centers or chrome with the black 5 triangles painted. However, I opted to 3D print my own wheels. These torque wheels were a very popular aftermarket wheel at the time, and I just thought they would look really good with the aggressive paint scheme on the Boss 302. Let me know what you think of them in the comments below. I made sure they fit the kit tires, which are really nice pad printed tires for the white lettering. Moving on to the other parts, I sprayed the chassis with a very dark gray, almost black color that I mixed up. It's a subtle detail, but I didn't use pure black because I already used that for the flat black portions of the paint scheme on the body. The gas tank is painted a steel color, and the spoiler, chin spoiler, and louvers were all painted pure black. I had another set of the chin spoiler and louvers, so I decided to paint them all. Then, I just painted other individual details of the kit for the engine and the interior. For the interior pieces, I painted them a very dark gray like the chassis, except I added a little bit more black along with some Tamiya X22 clear for a semi-gloss finish to replicate vinyl or leather. As mentioned before, I glued the hood shut so I won't be hyper detailing the engine bay. While I think that the engine details are cool, I figured that I'd rather put the time into building dioramas. The only time I really see myself detailing out an engine would be if the diorama was like of an automotive shop or maybe a broken down car on the side of the road, just a scene where you're forced to see the engine for one reason or another. And besides, it's kind of fun to just build the part straight out of the box for a change, especially since I won't really be seeing these details anyway. After assembling the engine, I masked off some trim areas on the door cards and dash, and I painted them with a bright silver paint. And then I added some chrome to the tops of the louvers. Then I unmasked all of the tape from the parts, and I began to paint the dash with a wood grain finish. The kit comes with some decals for these parts on the dash, but after watching some other modelers build this kit, they all say that the decals don't fit properly here. Now I can see why, considering that the holes on the gauges of the decals were perfect circles, but they should be more of an oval shape to account for the angled panel. Anyways, I base coated the wood parts of the dash in the steering wheel a light beige color. Then I went back over it with a glaze of a dark brown color. I'm putting it on kind of splotchy or streaky to imitate a wood grain texture. Lastly, I mix up a darker brown color for more of a defined wood grain. Honestly, it's not the most realistic wood grain surface, but it was quick and it'll be barely noticeable once the interior is installed anyways. If I wanted the dash to be super realistic, I probably would have imitated the wood grain with oil paint, but that takes forever to dry. I added some black wash around some of the silver details, and the wood grain texture on the steering wheel is coated with some Tamiya X22 clear. I installed some decals on the gauges using a brush and some more micro set and micro saw. Then, some small knobs and details were picked out using a Molotov chrome pen. I find this chrome paint has a hard time drying and it can dull when touched, so I don't like using it too much for exterior surfaces. However, I think it's great for really small details on the interior. I used the included decals of the wood panels on the door cards and the center console because those fit properly without a problem. Then, I added some epoxy to imitate glass over the gauges like I did for the Corvette. It doesn't look as good as the Corvette due to the styling of the gauge cluster and the surface tension of the epoxy resin, but overall it gets the idea across, I guess. The chairs are glued in place along with my 3D printed window cranks and the dash. I considered adding some flocking for the carpet, but with the chairs, the floor mats, and the louvers covering the back window, 90% of it wouldn't even be visible anyways, so I left it out. Now it's time to assemble all the parts. The reverse lights were pressed into place and glued from the back using super glue, and the fog lights were glued to the front bumper. I fit the interior tub in place and glued it down, then installed the chassis. It's a tight fit, but it went together fine, and I would say it went together easier than the Corvette model that I built previously. Then, a few more details were added underneath. I printed out a template for the rear Mustang badge and cut out the letters so I could use it for gluing my 3D printed letters. I thought this part was going to be one of the hardest, but it actually wasn't too bad. I put down a dab of white glue where I wanted each letter to go, and then I picked up the letters with my tweezers or X-Acto knife and popped it into place. The white glue allows me the time to reposition the letters to be straight, and it has more than enough grip for the really small letters. In all, this tedious part really only took me about 10 minutes, and I think that the chrome 3D prints are much more realistic than the silver decal. Using my tweezers and a little bit of white glue, I installed my 3D printed door locks and marker lights. Then, the 3D printed windshield wipers and door handles are glued in place, which look much more convincing than the ones molded into the body in my opinion. I installed the chin spoiler along with the chrome bumpers, and then I glued the wheels in place. Initially, my 3D printed wheels poked out of the fenders a bit too much, so I had to cut part of the kit back to get the wheel fitment to look nice. The louvers and wing are glued with more white glue, along with the 3D printed antenna holder and antenna made from guitar wire. I think adding the antenna, especially for these older cars, really adds so much realism to the final look. I 3D printed some license plates and designed my own Waterslide decals on some inkjet clear decal paper. I lost the footage of me applying the decal, but I think it turned out great. The 3D print has raised letters so the license plate has a stamped look to it. Last but not least, the gas cap is glued into place, and with that, the model is finished. Right away, I got some shots of the final result on my desk with some not too great lighting before taking it outside the next day to get much better lighting. As you can see, taking the model outside really shows how reflective the yellow is, and I love how it contrasts that satin black on the hood and rear sections. This model was quite a challenge for me. Overall, much more challenging than the Corvette kit. Lots of details were simplified, and I felt that I needed to design my own parts to make it look more realistic. Also, I found that there's just a decent amount of fitment issues unfortunately, but I love the way that it turned out, even with my couple mistakes on the clear coat. It's barely noticeable, and I think it's good to learn to live with some mistakes. As I mentioned in the Corvette video, both cars are going to be a part of my next large diorama, which I'm super excited for. It'll be comparable to the size of the Waffle House diorama, and I think that these cars will add so much to the atmosphere of it. Originally, I wanted to make a lot more cars, but this diorama is very challenging, and I think the time would be better spent only making 2 cars and then focusing on the diorama next. Let me know how you think this build turned out in the comments, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, I want to give a big thank you and shout out to all of my awesome Patreon members. Thank you so much for directly supporting me in my work, and please know that your generous contributions directly fund these models, and it means the world to me. If you'd like to support me and join my Patreon, check out the link in the description. Depending on what tier you select, you'll have access to behind the scenes updates of whatever project that I'm working on, as well as some exclusive Q&A videos, 3D print files for this project, as well as 3D files, PDFs of graphics and architectural drawings from my previous ones, and much more. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.